Welcome to the DevReady podcast, where we're helping non-techs build great tech. Today, we're joined by Conrad. He is a product manager at Robotics, supporting people in really AI robotics in the world of fresh produce. It's quite an interesting space, and I imagine quite challenging. Conrad's joining us to tell us a bit about a product, what it can mean, how do we manage it. He's been around startups, scale-ups, and some bigger businesses along the journey. I just want to bring some people in product that can really give you a different perspective on how do we build things rather than just focusing on what customers are saying, just trying to build feature after feature after feature as people can get stuck in. How might we manage that? Conrad, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew. Nice to be here.
For the audience out there, let's just dig in a little bit about your background. It's always a good way to start the conversation. Tell us a bit about you. Originally from Brazil, living now in Australia. Tell us a bit about your background and how you came to obviously live in Oz, and then all about what you've done in the world of product.
Yeah. So originally from Brazil, moved here when my mother remarried. Sort of did university in U, spent a couple of years in China with both language exchange and to work there. Fascinating time, very interesting economy and place to be at that time. And then spent a good few years in the energy industry before I joined the tech world, working both at energy regulator in the government, a big utility company, and then Bright, which is a fintech, but that was working on a energy product at the time, and can get into that a little bit more later.
In terms of the energy sector, it's quite a massive one that sort of impacts everyone that's listening in. What was it like working in regulation in that space? Because I imagine that compared to startups, it's going to be a very slow moving beast. What was that like compared to what you're doing now?
Yeah, very different. There's a lot of scrutiny, right? It's a very sensitive area, a basic service for millions of people. And you want to make sure it's fair for both businesses, citizens, tax-paying people, and there's also always a political element, especially in the last few years in Australia, climate wars. That's been a sensitive area. But specifically where I was with the Australian Energy Market Commission, it's a bit of an interesting body that it has. Powers given by all the states, so it functions as almost as an autonomous regulatory agency. And so even at a junior level, you get to do rule change processes for energy rules, and there's a degree of agility in there that you are talking to different stakeholders rather than setting it up 15 layers of bureaucracy. So it was quite a good starting point as a product manager to talk to stakeholders, do all of the technical research, talk to engineers and lawyers, and then put out a product, which was the policy position that we had. So I think it was very, very much slower and much of a lot of scrutiny compared to the startup world, but a good training ground.
It's like anything, right? Key stakeholder conversations are pivotal to anything in technical and product, and pivotal to getting any execution of anything. So I feel like it's good learning in something that's probably a little bit more challenging to get to an outcome, and then taking it to the startup world. What drew you to Bright? Why did you exit that regulation space and then moving into something that's a bit more startup scale up? What drew you to that world?
Yeah, I think it was really the opportunity to be in a more commercially and tech focused environment, be on the guts of something that was happening very quickly. They had Bright had been a really successful sort of fintech doing buy now pay later financing effectively for solar customers, and they wanted to start a new type of energy retailer, one that was really leveraging the price drops in solar and batteries to give people as close to zero bills as possible. And so that had a really interesting vision, a lot of investment coming in to start that energy team. And my skill set was I knew the energy industry quite well, and they were offering me an opportunity to effectively help build those product management, product development muscles. And so I sort of jumped into it, and it's a really interesting team. We had people from ex-Google, Atlassian, people that were really good at tech, but really didn't have any industry background. And so it was really a two-way street, and was one of the best periods of my career, I think, just learning so much with a team there.
Yeah, sounds like a good team that was put together. In terms of, it's always an interesting model. So you're in a business that's working, it's operating, looking to shift and bring in new product lines and streams. Um, how did Bright approach it? Because we've worked with a number of businesses that just put it in as BAU, have people that jump in and jump out of it. But how did they approach it? They obviously built a structured team around new products, and how was that really brought together to really try and deliver an outcome?
Yeah, I think to Bright's credit, I think certainly initially the early setup stage was really good, textbook in a sense of rather than just having a manager and a few reports from the existing structure. I think both legally, but then also organizationally, it was almost like a startup within a scale up, so a separated org without the pressures and expectations of the existing scale up. The team was pretty much, yeah, really loosely coupled with the financing. We still had to work with them, of course, but that gave us a lot of independence to set up our own culture, set up our own sort of objectives. We hired people mostly from scratch rather than just stealing them from the existing org. So that was, I think, a textbook case, and it worked really well. We still had to collaborate with the core business at times, but I think that independence was really important, really well done early on.
It is important because, like I said, I've worked with a number of organisations that attempt to just do it internally. But they don't really follow that textbook advice where it's just separate because it just pulls out all the red tape. The bigger the organisation, obviously, the more red tape. And as the business, like Bright, you mentioned, was what, Series C, D at that time. It was really getting some really good traction. And probably how many people did they have in the core business at that moment?
But the core business is probably closer to 150, and the energy team was 20, 30 people. And
Mm.
yeah, just similar to the point you just made, like if we had to prove revenue that was significant to the core business, we would have died early on.
Yeah,
We,
quite
we,
quickly.
we had the runway to really, the mandate was to learn as much as possible about this new and interesting thing around batteries and how they can affect energy bills and the customer proposition around that. It was a lot of hypothesis and learning driven experiment to a certain extent. So, yeah, good foundation there.
In terms of going into an organiser very early, right? What were taking your product hats with your regular energy regulation hat on? What were some of the things you approached as a team that you began? Was it a market research piece? Was it a how might we bring the technologies together? What is it all of the above? What was the angles that you took? Was it B2B, B2C? How did you approach those conversations in terms of market?
Yeah, it was for Bright specifically, it was challenging because it was a B to B to C model. So we worked with, to be clear, the solar installer, right? So the guys that literally go up on your roof and put up the solar panels on the batteries, and they're selling that sort of energy package that we just talked about with the battery, the solar, the finance to an end customer or a residential customer, moms and dads that want to take care of the bills. So we had to, yes, do customer research and user discovery both for the solar installers and the end customer, and so that was challenging, particularly as we moved into an operational phase because the solar installers had different incentives and business models in a sense that batteries were quite expensive, and a lot of the solar installers didn't necessarily know how to sell batteries to end customers. We could see a lot of the benefits, but we had to bring them in the journey and figure out their incentives. And so that was really challenging. How do we operationalize that? And then there's the whole compliance layer. I mean, we mentioned before, energy is basic service for everyone, but because of that, it's also very regulated. You can't have power going out or have customers falling for the cracks. And so there's a lot of compliance when you're disclosing and making an offer to customers, even if it's through a third party like we did. So that was from an operational perspective, really challenging.
The B2B to C model is quite fascinating because it's really you're targeting a business to be your sales arms, distribution arm team. What's some of the things you put into place? Because there's a model that people explore for those particular solar distribution partners, I would consider them in some capacity. What's some of the models you put in place to support them?
Yeah, so where possible, especially with the compliance stuff, and this is where we were strong, right? Our team, as I mentioned, had really good tech chops. And so what we wanted to do is, where possible, automate, build a tech platform or otherwise an automation solution that took a lot of the compliance burden out of their shoulders. And, so simple examples: when they had to go out and issue a quote for a customer, we basically wanted them to do their process, maybe add a couple of words from a compliance perspective, but then also to make sure it was there black and white and they didn't forget anything. When they sent out the quote, which is something they always did, automatically sort of a compliance document was sent to the customer to say, black and white, this is all the information, you have it there. If we missed anything, it's out there. So things like this really sort of, if you really want to make the life for your distribution partner as easy as possible, and that point behind understanding their incentives. And so we found out probably later on that we should have, that their margin, sort of their from a salesperson perspective for solar, was actually larger than selling a battery, even though battery was, it's something like 15 to 20K depending on the battery you get. But still the margins there were, really disincentivized solar installers from selling batteries. And so we had to address that later on. But yeah, some really important lessons there.
It's important because if they're selling services that are high margin and then you bring something in that's quite expensive, considering putting solar panels in a home would be less than the battery, more than likely. If the margin's less, it becomes what's the incentive for them
Yeah.
to actually push that out and really go commit to actually supporting the homeowner and taking that investment. So yeah, it is a fascinating one. We just got to manage the business model and how it all comes together. But yeah, some takeaways there. If you're looking at that B2B to C model, effectively treat the business as the distribution sales arm. How do you help them? Because they're your customer. That's going to get you in front of the customer. So it's a fascinating model. A lot of people explore, but then some people skip and they just go straight to how do we support the customer, and they forget about the person in the middle, which is really the angle who you should be helping, and that will change what you're building, what your roadmap looks like, and what your product looks like in terms of your tech side. So yeah, interesting piece. In terms of so you were on Bright. How long are you working at Bright for?
It's about a year and a half.
Yeah, yeah.
Sort of talked about sort of there was a lot of the tech space in Australia at that time, a lot of layoffs happening, and unfortunately, the whole energy team at that time was affected at Bright. Tough times, but don't regret a bit of my time there. It was really interesting company and really special people there.
That's really nice to hear. It's in terms of after COVID. I think during COVID, the tech sector had a bit of a nice ramp up, and then it sort of fizzled out quite quickly after that. So we had a good patch during COVID, which was an advantage, but the other end of it sort of fell off a cliff, as we all know in the tech space, and became quite a challenging sort of gap. And we're starting to get some momentum now again, which is nice to see
Yes.
in the space. So now, your latest role. Let's dig in a little bit there, just in terms of Lyra Robotics. Tell me a bit about that, what the learning's been in this early stage role, and what you're trying to achieve in that space.
Yeah, so Lyro had three co-founders that came from academia, sort of very deep
That's
research
an
in robotics.
interesting challenge, right? So coming from academia, I would imagine, because
Yeah,
there's
it's
academia to business and commercial, like in polar opposites. They're really black and white. One is just let's just research, and we spend 4 years doing something with no outcome other than a paper or papers coming from it. Financial is not really the goal. How do you change the mindset?
Yeah, so they, to be fair, when they, I think the kernel of Lyro, this is back in 2016, 17, I think, was they won an Amazon competition, so warehousing, computer vision challenge. So it was a very applied thing there. I think that gave the impetus for this longer R&D process between then until I think sort of last year, when we started doing sort of commercial type deployments with real customers. So I think it just probably talks to the complexity of the tech to deal with that. And to be clear, I mean, yes, it's ultimately a robotic arm picking up an object, but the difficulty for Lyra and the magic of the software is that the objects they're picking are highly variable. We're talking about different weights, colors, sizes. A fruit can be smashed, or every fruit is unique effectively across so many different types of indicators. And so having a system that can pick that and then pack it in a way that's ready for export or for to send to a retailer is a big challenge. It's taken a lot of time to get to a commercially sort of acceptable performance level.
It'd be fascinating, right? So a lot of computer vision, understanding the objects you're picking up, and like you said, every product is different. No apple is the same, no avocado is the same, no banana is the same. Yeah, it's an interesting model. So it's the same tech across all different fruit and veg. So yeah, it would be quite a challenge to produce that outcome, I would think.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we've specialized for sort of an initial market has been around let's call them the non-spherical produce. So we're talking about avocados, cucumbers, corn cobs, those types of produce where it's really hard with current systems, dumb systems to use. And so they've doing some deployments in avocado farms in North New South Wales and Queensland in particular. But there's just taking a step back from Lyra specifically, right? There's so much going on. Yes, in so the whole sort of written and audio and video space of AI, but there's a lot of work and a lot of funding going to humanoid robots and robotic space in general. So really interesting to see where the company's going the next few years, given the advances in the technology and funding globally.
Yeah, we're all seeing the humanoid robots walking around and what's going in that space. So that might just be the outcome or the final result or product at the end. But it'd be fascinating to see where that space goes. I think everyone's watching quite closely just to understand what's coming over the next few years, because it is evolving very quickly, and that's the joy of being a part of tech, and also the challenge, right? So you're a part of something that's moving that quickly that your technology can become redundant. So how do you manage that as you're in a new business and a stream and trying to carve out new opportunities and support other customers? It becomes a fascinating one, both from a product perspective, but also from a founder operator perspective as well. How are you finding that in Lyra as it's really early in terms of getting that commercialized? What does it look like?
Yeah, it's hardware is hard, as everyone has worked in hardware knows, because there's a lot of investment. Very hard to change hardware things once they've been ordered or deployed. What we're trying really hard is there's this responsiveness of it that you want to build your product for people that are generally interested in that you've signed an agreement to develop this. So say in one of our avocado farm partners, as an example, they have a clear sort of set of requirements and we're building to order. But then there's also, from a business development and growth perspective, you want to build a product set that addresses a larger market. And that's being really sort of the challenge right now, is try to find patterns in the customer research and user feedback and user problems that allow us to build not only for that avocado farmer, but to say sort of, I don't know, a poultry provider in the US or I don't know, banana provider in Mexico, these types of different clients. And so we're always struggling to sort of balance the need to address that immediate customer use case, but then also I've seen a trend of a few companies, particularly in the US, building platforms where you effectively upload your object you want picked and packed, and you almost sort of build your own application effectively. So the tech is moving that way, which is really, really interesting. But then at the same time, a lot of these companies, particularly in industrial sector, it's very high reliability, quality, performance standards, right? Especially food. There's a whole other layer of
There's a
safety.
whole process to get your technology in that world, right? So it's
Yes.
not just you rock up with something new tomorrow and it gets adopted. That is a challenge in those worlds.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why we're trying to navigate. What do you build? Sort of, what does that MVP look like beyond just the first few customers, so that you can address a larger market? And as a PM, it's fascinating as well, because you you have to talk to engineers to understand how far can we push this, how much is a self-serve versus we can just manually do that, and then but you're also talking to your salespeople, your founders, to understand what's the market demand, and you're doing your own customer research, talking to industrial integrators and the like as well.
Let's talk about managing stakeholders. One of the critical facets of, let's step away from what you're doing day to day, but from a stakeholder perspective, it's probably one of the most critical factors of anything in PM. It's where you can find your information, but also you need to really challenge your stakeholders too. Just taking by face value sometimes can be maybe the wrong way to approach it.
Yep.
Stakeholder says X, we do X. You have to dig a little bit deeper sometimes because maybe they don't have that technical nous that what's possible, or maybe they are technical stakeholders and they don't understand the sales side. So, from that perspective, what's some of the strategies you might use to really manage stakeholders to get the most out of it and then understand where you should really drive product? It's a difficult question,
Yeah.
but how might you think about that as you're really in the thick of product?
At an early stage startup, and you're a product manager, probably your most important stakeholder, as you can imagine, is your founder. Um, and if you're lucky, you have both a technical and an industry founder, and you can learn a lot from both of them and sort of manage expectations and the like around that. But yeah, the getting the founder relationship right is so important. Number one, because they have, most good founders have a lot of industry knowledge, and so they've done effectively months and hopefully years, sometimes decades of customer research effectively, and so you want to leverage that. That's a really important thing. The other thing that I always come in as a model is a lot of these founders, they've received investment and they've got where they've gotten because they have a superpower. Often, the one of the best in the world in X, Y, and Z. And yes, I try to leverage as much as I can of that superpower. But then also, you've got to be mindful that they have um, there's always sort of backdrop, or sort of a negative aspect of that. Other areas that they don't peak as much, right? So think about people like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs and all the famous guys. They always have their downsides, and so being very mindful of that and going to all the people in the organization that can help you sort of fill those gaps where the founder isn't potentially as strong is really important. So understanding that there's really sort of amazing human beings, but then also understanding that there are flaws that you have to sort of manage, and sometimes help the founder as well see some of issues that might be affecting the growth of the startup. I think that's one of the really important qualities as early stage product managers, having the backbone to um, stand up diplomatically. I don't mean in an aggressive way, but stand up to the founders and executives and say, this is the data we're getting, this is the customer feedback we're getting. Want to be transparent with you. This is the reality. Help me understand if I'm missing something. But if not, then I think we need to address this significantly. So, yeah, those are some of the tactics that I've used in the past.
If you go down that path a little bit, what makes a good founder that you've worked with before? Because we can have good and bad and indifferent. I think what you mentioned really is quite critical. We need to understand what we're good at and what some of our, maybe what we're not so good at. And if we can really get to that point, it becomes a lot easier to have those communications. Because as founders, I think some of the easy part is to just go hell for leather and really get stuck on the way you approach. But then your market may be saying otherwise, and it's difficult it is difficult to pivot. But if you're a founder that can pivot quickly, that can be quite good. But if you pivot too quickly, you could actually leave something behind. It's a balancing act, as we know, in this world. So understanding your superpowers, as you might call them, is quite important for PMs, founders, technical side. But as long as everyone's aware of what they're good at and what they're not, I think that brings some real harmony to the team. How do you find, who do you find works well in that world? Because I find that some founders, and I've been around this industry for 16 years, building technology, working with different founders, business owners, and the founders that aren't willing to learn and just think they know everything, they're the ones that really fail, I've noticed. The ones that are willing to just embrace, but then also real stick fat to what they believe in and just really try and maneuver with the market, I find work much better. And what have you found in that space in terms of how do you manage that?
Yeah, it's a really challenging thing because there's this, I'm not calling it a myth, but basically this perception in industry that the founder just needs to display grit and stick firm to what they believe in and things will work out. And you definitely need that grit, but then you also need to be responsive to the data and to the market and to what people around you are saying. So being willing to iterate around the solution space versus the problem space. We I've had opportunities in the past where the problem space was really obvious, but the solution wasn't just gelling with the market. And so being willing to deconstruct the product, bring it back to a few core features. Sometimes you build too much. Do
It's
test.
easy to build product, build the features, isn't it?
Exactly.
So it's quite, yeah, that's a simple thing. That's like a comfortable place, especially for the technical guy to go, oh, we just built some stuff. That's easy. Let's
Yeah.
keep building. But runway disappears really quickly as we keep building.
Yeah. And yeah, I found generally speaking, when you have that sort of yin and yang of a technical co-founder and an industry expert, those tend to be the best sort of teams to work with because you have someone at that level of authority and that has a stake in the business that's seeing both the technical product side and then also the industry commercial side and that creates it's not always successful, but creates a really good sort of power dynamic there that everyone can get listen and the pivots can happen when they need to usually.
Usually. let's talk about you sent me an article pre this. Let's dig in that a little bit, and it talked about what are the key like the gaps in building good products, and let's talk about that a little bit because there's some good nuance in there just for people to think about. In terms of one of the key things you spoke about, it's all about how do we drive product management in startups that actually works, and some of the gaps that you raised, and one was really escaping that feature factory model. Describe that a little bit for me because I was just speaking that a little bit, just building feature after feature. How does one do that? Because it's easier to get chimed into, let's just build more products. But some of the principles behind it, that 80-20 rule stands out quite considerably in this space because really 20% of what you do is probably going to get used and then the other 80% can get thrown in the bin. So having a core system that really does ABC really well
Yep.
is better than having a system that does A to Z averagely. Sometimes it's better just to focus on core. So how do we get out of that mindset of just build stuff? It's not easy, but how might you consider that when you're working inside of these businesses?
Yeah, I think the it might sound surprising, but this concept around product strategy is something that's not as mature across a lot of founders. They often have something in their mind, right? But putting that into paper often is a problem, and that will say we want to be the best of the world in X, Y, and Z, and then we can use that as sort of a founding document to really say whatever feature is really contributing to that vision or to that strategy we keep, and what's not we don't. Um, and and when you say something like you want to be the best in the world at something, then that means you have to invest a lot of time in a couple of core features to make them really world class, which I think all the product literature I've worked, a lot of the companies that double down on doing something really, really well, um, really polished, best of the world, they tend to succeed because they're they're knocking their customer socks off when they do that. And so, yes, sort of as a product manager, keeping that discipline in your team, and particularly as I mentioned, that the founders is really important because they're getting pressure to raise more capital, expand the team. How do you sort of push back gently and strategically to say, you've given us this product strategy, we're trying to keep to this. We think this is going to get you the best outcomes long term, even if we're not chasing all these shiny objects. So yeah, just as I said, early stage founder sort of PMs really need to have that backbone to be able to say we shouldn't be chasing all these shiny things unless there's a really, really good reason for it. Yeah.
Let's break that down. What makes a good product strategy? Because I agree. I don't think people really go down this path and push. What are we trying to become? They might just say we're building X for this industry, and then all of a sudden X becomes feature after feature. What is a real good? What have you seen in your space that's been a great product strategy?
Yeah. So I mentioned a few minutes ago, right? The founders often get to that stage where they say a Series A, a Series B startup because they spent sometimes years and decades in an industry knowing the customers and the problem space. What they're often really bad at is translating that into a document. I'm not talking about every single transcript of every single conversation, but recurring themes and patterns that sort of give you that confidence about what the problem in the problem space that you need your product to address. So having that down, effectively customer research and discovery written down is a really important point of a strategy. It has to be based on those customer insights, or else it's just my opinion is that we shall do this, and that's a terrible foundation for strategy. I think the second part is let's call it comprehensive in a sense that it's not just these are the cool features that we're going to build, as particularly in the development side, but it's also how does the features link to the distribution marketing strategy, how did that link to the business model, and so on. So I think there's a good framework from Reforge talking about the 4 fits: the market product fit, product channel fit, channel model fit, and model market fit. A bit complicated, but basically
It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
yeah. The concept is basically you're not just you have to consider the business implications and the channel distribution implications of your product, and so that needs to be reflected in the product strategy as well. And the other thing that's, again, surprisingly perhaps for people in Silicon Valley, but earlier stage startups, a lot of these product strategies tend to be siloed. They're often parts of it are in some sort of pitch deck to investors, and maybe they'll be talked once a quarter by the founders to the team to say, now we're doing strategic planning for the year or for the next quarter. My view is very much that it needs to be a document that's available there for everyone. Everyone needs, when they're being inducted into the company, they need to be able to read that to understand what's going on. But it needs to be revisited weekly when you're sort of thinking about your sprint planning or things like that, right? How is this contributing to this product strategy or not? And the other part of being siloed, bad product strategy being siloed, is that the market changes and expectations of technology change. And so the strategy is a living document. It's not just set and forget. You have to be able to, I suppose, when salespeople are hearing really consistent feedback, when product people are hearing consistent feedback, founders need to be able to listen to that and then say, okay, well, we need to adjust this part of the strategy. We're still dealing with the same problem. We're still passionate about that, but our strategy here is gonna be changing slightly. So making a live document and talking about it as well frequently is really important. And so I think underutilized by a lot of founders because they're so focused on execution, or they want people to be focused on execution. But I found that if you do talk about strategy, that helps motivate and make sense of things for people.
Just to play that back a little bit, setting up a product strategy will be based on effectively client, business, the model, the commercials, everything coming together. And then it needs to evolve. Sales conversations, customer conversations, technical conversations, limitations, feedback needs to keep feeding through this. Maybe competitors needs to get feeding through this. What are they doing compared to what we're doing?
Yeah.
That sort of angle. So it's a continuous living document that we can really make decisions from and empower our people, our team
Yeah.
to really drive from rather than let's build feature after feature after feature. Let's really assess that feature on is it working towards strategy? Is that how you think about it?
Yes, yes, very much so. I think it needs to be the best founders. We talked about founders having the grit and being able to iterate. It's similar thing with the strategy, right? The has to have a core of the strategy that doesn't change, but there's a lot of aspects of it that need to adapt to market reality. So the best founders I've worked with have been open enough to say, well, we're getting data that this isn't working. We need to adapt that strategy, or we're going to try something else to see if this is really the problem or not. So yeah, very much similar model to that I have.
Got it. So, and then you that will only help the rest. So you got a couple other gaps that you talk about in your article. The next one is all about cash, right? So we're limited by what we can invest, but if we have a good product strategy, that's going to help us keep us in a frame of where we're focusing our energy. It's not going to just we're not going to get feature after feature ending up in a backlog that we're just continuously building. We're assessing those features on something that's a bit more pivotal to the strategy where we're going in direction. That's really going to help that cash burn, you would imagine.
Yeah. From when I wrote the article, one of the few things that was in my mind with sort of the runway is that we we want the company to survive, we want the company to grow, and yet not a willingness to invest a lot of money in user research, customer discovery to really get a clear North Star in the direction we should be going. And so I think we need to create a culture, especially when you have a founder that hasn't worked in the tech space necessarily, but is very confident about their industry knowledge. You still need to invest on customer research, to sort of, you have situations when the founders' networks are using the product, and that's great, but is that a reflection of their relationship with the founder, or is it a reflection of the quality of the product and how well it's solving? So you want to separate that, and you want to be intellectually honest as a
It's
product.
a really good point. Yeah, because you might be in an industry you've known forever and you've got all these people that you know and they're just using the product because you know them and you're holding their hand and they're supporting you in some capacity. But will that scale outside of your network? It's a really good point.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll dig into, we'll go through the rest of the gaps. So the next one would be more metrics around how we're measuring from commercial technical components and how we're measuring product and how it's really achieving. What's some of the areas or things you might consider in how do we measure how our customers are using our product? What's some of the tools you might use in this space?
Yeah, look, I think the tools, be it a mix panel or an amplitude from a product analytics perspective, are important, but perhaps not the most challenging things. I mean, there's always a bit of from a development perspective, you appreciate there's still a situation of building events and sort of building an analytics infrastructure that's not cheap and not easy, but if you get it done, right at a foundational level, it can be really important. And I've been part of process of building that, and it can be really transformational. But I think the most challenging part of it is the meaning of the metrics to the company as a whole. So we talked before about metrics having both an external and an internal significance, and internally it being important for company morale, and sort of keeping people motivated. The company is going in a direction, we're hitting revenue targets or number of users and so on. externally as well, you want to tell a really good story to investors. And so when you're in a meeting effectively trying to determine how to frame those metrics, if you only have those things in mind, you're going to say define something as simple as monthly active users in a way that's potentially quite low, sort of low hanging fruit in a way. So you just someone that's logged into the product is an active user. As a product manager, my view tends to be quite different. We need to think about substantial actions
There's
into
engagement,
product.
yeah? They're engaging in the product,
You're
not
actually
just,
engaging, doing
okay,
something
yeah.
meaningful of value in the product rather than just accidentally logging in potentially. And so overall, my vision around metrics, product metrics, is pretty much how can you be as intellectually honest as possible to get a hand and feel for what's going on into the product. If there's a problem in a part of the funnel or features or a conversion sort of process, we want to know, we need to know, and we need to address that rather than just massaging the message for some sort of audience. And so that can be a bit of a contentious process sometimes, but really important to align with your founders in that, like, how do we sort of get to the right outcome there? I'm not saying that it's only the product way or the highway here. I think you need to understand that you need to get investment money. You need to keep the troops motivated, but you also need to make decisions with correct data, correct interpretation of the data.
I think it's really important that we all just make educated decisions. Um, it's easier to keep following the path of what you're doing now. That's the thing. It's just that's the nice little frame. But if something challenges your thinking, that's where it gets a little bit hard in the world of stuff. Okay, we might need to pivot and shift, and how do we understand or dig into that information? It's easy to make things look good. It's like data, right? Any sort of data, we can make it look good or we can make it look bad. But what's the reality, and how do we get to the reality? So, and they have to make decisions on the reality. I think that's really a pivotal piece where some people get sort of stuck in the mindset of, no, we're following this path, and they get really stuck on it rather than reacting or being aware of what's going on in their product in detail. If you don't have that metrics, you can't really get there. And I don't think there's a way. So you do need some really good metrics coming through your product in terms of how people are engaging, how are they using it. Are you sitting down with customers, getting in one-on-one feedback in terms of their challenges, what's working for them, what's not? Where could you improve the product? If you're hearing it 3 or 4 times, it's pretty much could tell you a good
Yep.
story that, yep, there's some gaps there. And then how do we work with those gaps? Because no products can be perfect, especially early days. The goal is to help more people. And if we're helping our current customers get a better outcome, we're likely to be helping more customers as they come on the journey to be more sticky and get an outcome right away. So we just got to be, I wouldn't say reactive to the customer because you still got to follow your strategy as you mentioned,
Yep.
but at least learning, especially big roadblocks that come up, we really got to really answer those as quick as we can because at that point we also win customers where they're helping with the product direction because they're giving good feedback and then you're listening to that feedback, which makes customers more sticky. So there's a whole caveat of how do we support customers and build that stickiness in the product because that's what we're really after, right? We don't want a product that people sign up for, they play with it for a day and then they go. If we get 1 million people playing it for the day and they go, the numbers can be set. Oh, we got 1 million signups this month. Next month, there's no one using the product. So really, that's not going to work for anyone in a long-term perspective.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have to. This is, yeah, one of the fascinating things with being a early stage PM is that you have to know and want to know and understand how the whole sort of business works. So you have to work with the marketing team, the sales team, to make sure that what they're promising and how they're positioning the product matches what you're actually delivering in the UI and what it's doing for the customer in the end of the day. Because if you don't, then you have these sort of massive drops in retention, and 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 especially if you're running a SaaS subscription business, you're in trouble because you need
Yeah,
that trend's going to happen.
definitely trouble. So there's plenty to learn from that piece there in terms of just if anyone's going down this path, it's really critical. Let's set up a strategy. Let's understand we're investing. The strategy will help with the the areas of what we're investing in and make them more critical. And then from a perspective of, okay, how do we measure to make sure we're investing in the right places, have really good conversations with our customers. One of the last things you talk about is tech density is low. What does that mean? For anyone that's out there, what's one of these other gaps that we can explore from a tech density perspective?
Yeah, look, I haven't coined that term. The whole talent density concept came from the Netflix culture book, Reed Hastings. I think it was the No Rules Rules, fantastic book. And they talked one of the foundational parts of their people strategy or building strategy is get the talent density high. So you really want really highly qualified people that are adding value to the company. What I found in terms of making the lives of PMs easier is that when you're in a tech talent density sort of dense company, so you have a lot of tech talent that understands how product works and what function it plays, and that it should be empowered rather than just, we talked about feature factory mode, then your life is very, very different as a PM. So that density is actually a really critical point. If you're working in a place that understands what PMs can do and should do versus you're just an execution tool, that makes a lot of difference. And to be fair, I think, it's not to say that this sort of tech talent is the only factor there. I think a lot of it is how do you match your talent to the actual market and problem you're dealing with. But generally speaking, with SaaS environment and SaaS products, I've found that when you have a density of tech talent, that tends to create a really good environment for PMs. And certainly all of the podcasts and the literature out there is they're teaching you how to succeed in an environment that has high tech density. And so that's one of my big beefs is that you don't have enough advice out there for PMs dealing with a non-technical co-founder or, dealing in a situation where you have a lot of industry experts in your team, but you still want to build a product culture and deliver a really good product. There's not enough of a support system on PMs to succeed in those types of environments. So that's why I wanted to spotlight that issue around tech talent density, because that's one of the deciding factors about whether you can easily succeed or not in an early stage startup as a PM.
It is an interesting one. If you're walking into an environment where you've got a founder which maybe is really good domain expert but's got no technical understanding, for example, tracking metrics that we just discussed about, what does that mean? What are some of the key things we'll be tracking? They're very different to having a domain expertise in the space of energy that we discussed earlier. They're completely different industries or levels of information that we need to understand, and how do we drive a technical product and deliver a technical product that's really going to work, or a SaaS product that's really going to work. So educating everyone in the team that's probably has a bit of a gap in that space would be quite interesting. Have you been a part of an organization that's been in that space where there's probably that low tech density from a talent perspective? And then how might you pull that apart and actually educate people along the journey?
Well, we can even we talked earlier in the podcast about Bright, right? And Bright is a really interesting situation where the energy team that we worked on, as I mentioned, there's a lot of people come from Atlassian or Google and places like that. And so the tech talent density there was really high, but with relatively poor industry knowledge. I would argue that the core business, the fintech side of Bright, had sort of an opposite situation where the sales and finance part of finance infrastructure part of the team they're all superstars, and they managed to grow the business significantly because all that issue that I just talked about, being matching the talent with the problem that you're trying to deal. So they needed really good sales and finance people to make Bright get to where it was at the finance side. For energy, it was a different story. So I've sort of experienced both sides of the coin. It's much easier to be a PM when you have tech talent density, because everything sort of just fits into place, and you're spotting. You don't need to push back as much against leadership. You're not sort of in that feature factory mode. as much. But certainly, if you have the right sort of manager, head of product in a low tech density environment, that can also sort of work well.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Conrad, we could probably talk for a little bit more and go more detail, but we'll cut there. Thank you for joining us on the DevReady podcast. I know we've gone over today, but I really appreciate digging in and just looking at some of the areas that people might consider as they're looking at building a tech product, especially in that early stage as we start to scale. Or if you're in a business and how you might carve out a technical product, which is a new product stream, because there's some really good insight as to you probably want to separate it from your core business because the reality is if it's managed the same way your core business is, it's going to really not going to work over a 3 to 4 month period. You'll realize that there's no revenue and how do you actually drive this? So it really is good to separate it out as you did with the Bright example. But thank you for coming on, sharing your journey today. I'd love to catch up in a year or so, understand how everything's going in the new role and what that looks like in the world of robotics. It's a dynamic thing, it's always changing, but really appreciate you coming on, sharing your stories, and hopefully we helped someone out today that's listening in on DevReady podcast.
No worries. Thanks so much, Andrew. It's great to speak to you.
Thank you.